Previously, we'd gone over what dynamic maps are and walked through the process of creating our own dungeon portal using dynamic maps. There was one issue though. The portal required you to have your entire party in the same room, and the moment someone utilized the portal, all players, regardless of whether they wanted to or not, would be forced into the instance dungeon. This doesn't really make for the best gameplay experience, so today we are going to build a reservation system such that players can search for open parties that are looking for a group, and only those that are in the same party will join the dungeon together. We'll be able to define a max party count per dungeon, and once the max capacity for a party is reached, subsequent users will be grouped into their own party. We'll also handle cases such as players leaving the game to make sure that we always have the proper player count, and reopen rooms that were once full but now reopen due to players leaving. And with that, let's get right into it. So here we are in Maker, and we are in the previous project that we did for our previous video. If you haven't watched that already, I highly recommend you watch that video where I go over the basics and a high-level overview of dynamic maps and go into a simple implementation of dynamic maps. Today, we're going to go into a more advanced implementation. So this is our previous implementation. If we have multiple players, all players will be bumped together as soon as they use this portal into our dynamic maps. And then once we defeat the Yeti, we are bumped back into our starting map. And today we're going to build a party system. So we have this UI here that we're going to utilize. I've already built this out, and this is just kind of an extension of this basic pop-up 2 UI here. And I just utilized this same UI. I added some buttons down here, and that's really it. So I encourage you to build this UI out just as it is here, or feel free to play around with how to design and utilize this UI here. But with that said, before we get into anything with the UI, let's first build out our basic data structures. So what we're going to do first is we're going to create a dynamic map info structure. So this is our UI stuff. This is a model that I used for that UI. We're going to build out this UI in just a moment. But first, as I mentioned, let's close out this UI folder, right click, and let's create a struct type, and let's name this DynamicMapInfo. We'll double click to open this up. And inside of here, we're gonna create a couple properties. The first one's gonna be a number, and we're gonna name it max players. We're gonna default to, let's say default to 10, but we can of course change this later. And then let's add a string of the map name that we want to move into. So we'll just name this map name. And then let's have an integer of our IDX, which is going to keep track of the unique dynamic maps that we've created so far. And then let's also have a table of our users. So this is going to be the table of users that have entered into the map. We're going to have a separate table for our reservation. So these are going to be the users that appear in the UI before they go into the map. So we're going to keep track of who has reserved to be part of the party. So reservations table, just like that. And then let's add our initialization function. So we're going to create a method named init, and let's add our parameters. We'll add 2 parameters here. 1, 2. We'll have this an integer type, and we'll name it max players. And we'll have a string type of map name. So whenever players create this dynamic map, we will have this max player setting for this dynamic map. So we're going to initialize these values to the map name that we pass in, the max players that we pass in, and we're going to initialize the reservations and users to an empty table. The next thing we'll want to do is we'll want to create a scene management. So let's create a logic script. This is going to be a global script that can be accessible by any component, and we'll name this scene management. And let's double click to open this up. And let's create a method here, and we'll name this init dynamic map. Same thing here. We're going to add 2 parameters. The first is going to be the string of the map name. The second is going to be an integer of max players. So let's paste our code in here. And let's also add in a property. We won't sync this. We're going to name this a table, and we're going to name this Dynamic Map Infos. So whenever we call this init dynamic map function from our components, we're going to actually be calling this from our dynamic map portal when we add on to this script in just a bit. But when we call this function, it's basically going to be able to create a blueprint or define the parameters for our blueprint so that we can start pumping dynamic maps based on this data. So subsequent dynamic maps that are created will be created based on the max player count and the map name that has been passed in to this initialize function. So inside of our dynamic map portal, let's actually do just that. We already have our map name in here, but we're going to also add in the non-synchronized property of an integer for number of players. So we'll do max players. So this will be the maximum number of players for this dungeon. And then on begin play, let's add in our scene management, init dynamic map, and we'll do self.map name and self.max players. So here in our on begin play of our dynamic map portal, we're going to initialize with our map name and max players, and it effectively create a blueprint for our dynamic map information. Something I have forgot to do is let's make sure that this function execution space setting is a server-side function, because we're going to keep our dynamic map information table a server-side, so that all of our dynamic map management in terms of what kinds of users, how many users are reserving and entering to the map, we're going to all manage server-side. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is build out the logic for our dynamic map creation, the reservation system, and all of that. So first, let's drop into our DynamicMapInfo structure, and let's add in first the map generation. So let's add in another function, and let's name this generate map. This won't have any parameters, and we're just going to have this logic here, and we're going to have a return value of string. So it's going to generate our map, and it's going to create a new name for our map using the map name and an IDX for our current map, and then it's going to increment by 1. And then we're going to use our dynamic map service to create a dynamic map, and we're going to pass in the map name and our new map name, which is going to be our combination of our map name plus the IDX. And then we're going to check if the map creation was a success, and we're going to initialize our users with the new map name to an empty table. Finally, we're going to return the new map name that we've created. Next, let's add in the reservation logic for reserving this map. So this is kind of like the party creation process. So let's create another function here, and let's name this reserve map. Let's add in 2 parameters. The first is going to be type string, and the second is also going to be type string, and we're going to name this instance name and user ID. And let me pull the code in here really quick. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to pass in the instance name, which is going to be the ID of the instance name that was created. Remember that we have initialized the users to an empty table upon the map generation. So this map should exist at the time of creation. If it doesn't, then that means this step hasn't happened yet. So the map hasn't been generated yet. So that's what's happening here. Then we're going to actually reserve the map. So we're going to grab our reservations table. If it doesn't exist yet, meaning it's nil, then we're going to initialize to an empty table. And then we're going to set the instance name to the new reservation. So we're going to set our local property to the new empty reservations table. Then we're going to take that reservations table, and we're going to append the user ID to this reservations table. Next, let's add another function in for our get reservations. So this will allow us to retrieve the reservations that we have created. So we're going to add in a parameter of string instance name. So when we pass in our instance, if the reservations exist, it's going to return the reservations. Otherwise, it's going to return nil. We, of course, are going to get a table of our reservations. So we're going to get a list of the users that have currently reserved our instance map. So we're going to pass in the instance name and return the reservations. Let's add in an unregistration function, and this will allow users to unregister the map. So let's name this unregister map, and let's add in two parameters here. The first is going to be the instance name, and the second is going to be a string of user ID, and then what we're going to do here is, based on this user ID, first we're going to grab the reservations user table based on the instance name. If it exists, then we're going to move on. If it doesn't, then that means that there are no reservations yet for this instance map. So we're going to initialize an empty found user variable, and we're also going to store the index of the user, and we're going to then loop through our reservations and see if it's a match. If it's a match, then we're going to cache the index of the user, and then we're going to check if the found user is no longer nil. If that's the case, then we're going to remove from the reservations table the index of the user to remove. In the case that there was no user in this reservations, meaning that this reservation never existed, then we're going to just log out that this user does not exist in this instance. Okay, so now that we have the ability to reserve the map, to get the list of reservations and unregister from this map, we are then going to create a way to move reservations into our target map. So let's create a function, move reservations. Let's add this parameter of type string and instance name. And we're going to move our reservations into our target instance map. So based on the dynamic map that was created, we're going to get the reservation based on the dynamic map instance name. If that exists, then we're going to loop through each of the users in this reservation, and we're going to move the players into the map through this enter map function that we're going to create in just a moment. And then we're going to set the reservations to nil. Next, of course, create our enter map function. So let's add another function here, and let's name this enter map. We're going to have two parameters here. The first is going to be of type string of the instance name. The second is also going to be a string of the user ID. And then let's take a look at the logic here. We're going to grab the users from this current instance, and if that user exists, meaning at this point, because we're trying to enter into this map, of course this user table would be empty, but because at this generate map step we have set this users to an empty table, it would at least exist. So that's why we're checking this, so that we can check for the existence of this instance map. If it does exist, then we're going to get the number of users in this user table, and if it is greater than the max players for this dynamic map, then we cannot enter into this table because the map is full. Otherwise, we're going to add the list of users to the user table, and this user table is going to track the users that are actually in the map. And then we're going to get the user entity based on the passed in user ID, and we're going to teleport that user into our instance map. If we have an enter map function, we of course need to have a leave map function. So let's do a leave map function here, and let's add two parameters. The first is going to be string. The second is also going to be string. And let's add in user ID and the instance name. Okay, and taking a look at the logic here, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to check if the instance map exists by checking for the user table. If it does exist, Then we're going to move on. We're also going to return if the user table is empty, meaning there are no users in this instance map, meaning there's no point in leaving the map because there's no users in it. And then we're going to loop through all of the users in our user table, and then we're going to try to find the user that we are trying to remove from this map. If the user exists, then we're going to remove from this table, and then we're going to set the user table to nil, and then we're going to destroy the dynamic map. Then we're going to set the user table to this user table. And speaking of, we're actually going to do the same thing right here. When we had added the user into our user table, we also need to make sure that we assigned this users to the new user table so that we update the value of this users table. So here we have updated with the removed user, and then here we have updated with the new user to enter into the user. So we have our enter and leave map methods complete. We are also going to add in a function for finding the next open map. So this will be used for when users search for an open party so that they can reserve the map. This will be used when users search for an open party so that they can reserve this map. So let's name this find open map. So this will loop through all of our instances and search for an open map. We're going to return string here, the instance map name. And as far as the logic goes, again, relatively simple. We're going to set our initial variable for our found map. Then we're going to loop through the list of all the users inside of our users table. And inside of each user table that we find inside, we're going to get the user count. We're also going to get the reservations. So the reservations for this map, we're going to grab all of the reservations for this map instance. And we're going to also add that to the total user count. If the number of reserved users plus the users in the map is less than the maximum number of players, then we're going to return this map. Otherwise, if none of this exists, then we're going to return a nil for found map. Let's also add in a method for searching for an instance map, so a dynamic instance map, based on the user ID. So we'll name this get instance, and we'll pass in the string of user ID, and let's return the map ID that we found. And I've left a little note here saying that this function should be a little bit more optimized because we are just literally looping through all of the users and all of the reservations and then searching for if the user exists in that user table and if the user exists on the reservations. So this function should not be overused because it can be a little bit inefficient to call this too often. Okay, so we have this utils function here that doesn't yet exist. So this is going to be our own custom utility function that searches a certain table for a value and returns if this value exists in this table. So let's create that. Let's create a common folder. And let's right click and let's create a logic script and name this utils. Let's double click to open this up and let's add in a new function. Name this contains. And let's return a boolean. And let's add in two parameters. First will be the table. Second will be the value to check. So let's do table, target list. And let's add in the value to check. And here we will simply loop through the values inside of our target list for the value to check. If it exists, then we're going to set contains to true and return contains. Otherwise, it's going to return false. So back into our DynamicMapInfo, we can see, if we press space here just to refresh it, we can see our contains function now exists. The final thing we're going to do is we are going to add the ability to close our dynamic map. So for the users that are in our dynamic map, let's say after we've defeated the boss, we're going to grab all of the users and pull them out of there into our target map. So let's name this close dynamic map, and we'll add in two parameters here. The first parameter is going to be the current instance name. The second parameter is going to be our target map. And then for our logic, we're going to set our user table to the users and check if this instance exists, same way that we're doing to check if this map exists. So here, if that instance map or dynamic map exists, then we're going to loop through all of the users that are inside of this map. So this will be the users table, and we're going to pull them out of the map into our target map by calling our teleport service, teleport to map position, pass in the user entity that we grab here based on the user ID, and then move them into the target map that we pass in. Then we're going to set the users table to nil, and we're going to destroy our dynamic map. So that takes care of our DynamicMapInfo struct. Let's now move into our scene management. But before that, we're going to quickly create an event that we're going to need here. So let's, inside of our dynamic map, let's right click, let's create a folder, name this events. And let's create an event type, dynamic map reserved event. So this will be an event, as the name implies, that will be sent whenever a dynamic map is reserved. So we're going to update our clients of the new user list every time the map is reserved, meaning that someone enters into a party and the other clients have to be updated with the new user list and populate the new user into their UI. So this is going to be what will be taking care of that. So for this, we're going to need two properties, and that's it. The first is going to be a string of the map instance ID. So this will be the dynamic map ID. And we're going to keep this property initialization to empty. We're going to also have a table of users. And then let's finally go back into our scene management. And let's add in the functions for actually reserving our map, entering the map, and things like that. So first function we're going to do is we're going to name a function create dynamic map. And this will be a server-side function, because remember, whenever we're creating maps, whenever we're managing the players in a map, all of that will be managed server-side. We will have a parameter in here, and we'll name this map name, and we'll drop in the logic here. In this, we're going to return a type string so that we return the name of the dynamic map that we created. So here, we're going to grab our dynamic map info. So if the dynamic map info has been initialized, meaning that we've set that value here, and we have the blueprint data, quote unquote, for this dynamic map, then we're going to continue. Otherwise, we're going to send a warning that this map has not been initialized yet, meaning that there is no max player count information, the map name information, any of that for this dynamic map. So we're going to return. Otherwise, we're going to continue, and we're going to just call our generate map function and return the new map name. Next, we're going to create another function, reserve dynamic map. Let's add in two parameters. String user ID and the string of our map name. We're going to set this as a server-side function. And let's paste in our code here. Let's set this return type to string, because when we reserve the dynamic map, we're going to return the open dynamic map. Okay, so this function will be called whenever the player searches for an open room and tries to create a party. So here we're again checking if the dynamic map exists. Then we're going to find the open map. Remember the function that we had created to find an open map. And if an open map doesn't exist yet, meaning there hasn't been any dynamic maps yet created, then we're going to create a dynamic map. So it will be either if there are no open dynamic maps, or there hasn't been one yet created. So in either case, it's going to be nil, and we're going to set this to our new dynamic map that we create using this function up here. Once we have this open map, we're going to get a list of reserved users, and we're going to define this function in just a moment. And we're going to check if the reserved users contains this user ID. If it does, then the user has already registered, so there's no need to register him again. Otherwise, we're going to move on and we're going to get the user entity based on the user ID. And if that user exists, then we're going to reserve the map using the reserve map function that we had created in our DynamicMapInfo. And we're going to set our reservations to our get reservations. And we're going to get a list of the current reservations. So all the users that have reserved this map, and we're going to loop through each of those users, and we're going to send the reservation event so that we can update the UI for those people that have already registered with this new user information. So their UI would effectively populate with this new user that has just registered and has joined their party. Okay, so we have two methods to define here. Okay, sorry, we have named this incorrectly. It should be reservations with an S. Sorry about that. If you go back in here now into our scene management, press space to update, we can see the squiggly disappear for this get reservations. So we have just two functions that we have to define: get reserved users and send reservation event. So first, let's define our send reservations event function. Let's name this send reservation event, and we're going to add in two parameters. The first will be string, and the second will be a table. And we're going to name this map instance name, and we're going to get a table of the users. Let's make sure that we set this as a client-side function because we're sending this event from our reserved dynamic map server-side function down as a client-side reservation event. So notice that we have only two parameters here, yet we are passing in three. This third parameter is going to target just that user and send this event just to those users. So normally if we didn't have this parameter, it would send this event to all clients. But because we're passing in this third parameter, we are targeting just that user to send this event to. So this would be all the users that have already registered, meaning the users that are already in the party. So we have this send reservation event, and we have the map instance name. Let me see a squiggly here. Let's double check to make sure that we have named this event properly. Of course we have not. Let's rename that and go back into scene management. And there we go, squiggly disappeared. And now we have our send reservation event. We're going to create this event and we're going to send this event to ourselves. Later when we listen for this event, we're going to listen for the scene management logic strip, and we'll go into that when we listen for this event. Next, we have to define this get reserved user function. So let's add get reserved users, and this will be a server-side function because our reserved users will be server-side. And let's add in one parameter here of type string, and let's name this map instance name. And we're going to return a table type here. And for the logic, we're going to first get our map name. So with the map name that we passed in, we're going to get the map name by splitting. So we have our util logic that's already built into MapleStory Worlds. And we have this split function that we can use to split by this underscore. So when we created our dynamic map in our DynamicMapInfo, it is split by the map name and the IDX. So here we are going to get the map name based on that split, check if that exists. If it does, then we're going to call mapinfo get reservations based on the map instance name. So this will return all the reserved users for this map. So up here, we are getting all of the reserved users for this map. Same thing down here, we're calling get reservations and pulling all the users that are reserved in this map. Now that we have that, we also need a way to unregister the players from the map if they choose to leave the party. So we'll name this function unregister dynamic map. We'll add in two parameters, first and second. The first parameter we're going to do of type string, and we're going to pass in the map name. The second parameter, we're going to do another string, and we're going to pass in the user ID. We're going to set the execution space setting to server, again, because we're handling all our reservations server side. And let's pull in the logic here. So here we are unregistering our users. We're going to pass in our map name. If that map exists, then we're going to continue. We're going to get the instance name based on the user ID. And in this function, again, we are looping through our reservations and our users to grab the dynamic map ID based on this user ID. Again, we have to refrain from overusing this function. So in our scene management, we're going to call this once whenever a user chooses to unregister this map. If the map exists, then we're going to unregister, calling our function that we created in our map info. And then we're going to send the updated registration event to all the users that are left in this reservation list. So again, it will update the UI for the reservation. And then we're also going to send the reservation event to the initial user so that when they leave the party, their UI also updates to the proper UI for after they leave the party. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to add in a function to move our registered players into the map. So we're going to name this move reservations to map. And we're going to add in a parameter here, string of the map instance name. And this will be, again, a server-side function. And let's take a look at the logic. So again, we're going to split based on the underscore to get the map name and check if this dynamic map information exists. If it does, then we're going to move all the current reserved users of this map instance or dynamic map instance will be moved into this dynamic map. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add in an event handler for what happens when a user leaves the map. So after entering the map, we're going to handle the case where the user leaves this instance map. So we're going to have to remove that user from our user table inside of our map information. So we're going to search for the user leave event. We're going to click on that and we're going to grab the user ID. And we're going to also get a couple more information here. So we're going to grab the user entity based on this user ID, and we're going to split the current map name. So this would theoretically be the dynamic map that's created, and we're going to split that by the underscore. Then, if the map name exists within our dynamic map infos table, then we're going to call leave map on that map information. So leave map, remember, searches for the user and removes them from the user table. So we have the way to handle when users leave the map. We also need a way to handle when users leave during registration. So after they enter into a party, when they leave, we want to handle that so that all the players get updated UI after they leave the registration. So we're going to create a function called find instance name. Make sure we spell that properly. We're going to add in two parameters of string and the map name. We're going to add in another property, string of the user ID. So we'll copy and paste this in right here. And let's set this execution space setting to server. And we're going to return a string of dynamic map instance based on the user ID. So we're passing in the user's map name, and then we're going to check if the dynamic map info exists. Then we're going to call get instance from the map info. And we're going to see how this is utilized after we get into the portal events. But for now, we'll just keep this function here, close this up. So the last thing we're going to add is the close dynamic map function. So this is going to finally close our dynamic map. So let's set the execution space setting to server again. And let's add in two parameters. First one is going to be the map instance name. The second is going to be our target map to move our players into before we close the map. So again, we're getting the map name by the split and checking if that exists. And then we're going to simply call close dynamic map that we created earlier in map info. So with that, we have settled all of our server-side functions for our scene management of our dynamic map creation, reservation, and also handlers for when users leave a map. And we've also set up all of our dynamic map info structures for actually moving players into our map, keeping track of our users, and other things like that. let's actually now go into the client-side scripts for setting up our portal and our UI. Up until now, we've learned how to set up the server side for our dynamic map system and reservation systems. Join me in our next video as we dive into the client side to connect our different UI to the functions we've set up on our server-side scene management.